He was the most powerful man on earth, a ruler whose empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. His name was Suleiman the Magnificent, and she was no queen, no noblewoman, no daughter of a dynasty. She was a slave, torn from her homeland in Eastern Europe, dragged in chains to the Ottoman palace. Her name was Hürrem. No one in that gilded cage of the harem expected her to rise. No one imagined that this young woman, armed with nothing but her wit, her charm, and a fire in her heart, would capture the sultan's soul. In a world where sultans never married their concubines, where women were meant to be silent shadows behind palace walls, Suleiman did the unthinkable. He broke centuries of tradition for her. He crowned her not just as his consort, but as his wife, his partner, his queen. Their love would ignite scandal, reshape the empire, and leave a legacy written in both blood and poetry. 500 years later, historians still ask, was it true love, or the greatest manipulation in history? Suleiman the Magnificent. To the west, he was feared as the Grand Turk, a conqueror whose armies battered at the gates of Christian Europe. To the east, he was seen as a shadow of destiny, a man chosen by God to rule over millions. When he ascended the throne in 1520, he inherited the largest and most powerful empire on earth. Under his rule, the Ottoman Empire reached its golden age. He commanded vast armies, expanded trade routes, and presided over a court glittering with wealth and culture. His word was law, his command absolute. To his people, he was more than just a man. He was the Caliph of Islam, the defender of the faith, and the living embodiment of imperial might. But even the most powerful ruler can be brought to his knees by something far stronger than armies: love. Enter Hürrem. She was born far away from the marble halls of Topkapi Palace, in the cold plains of Ruthenia, today's Ukraine. As a young girl, she was kidnapped by raiders, ripped away from her family, and sold into slavery. Her journey ended in Istanbul, inside the Sultan's harem, a world of silk and gold, but also of cages and chains. The harem was not a place of romance. It was a battlefield. Dozens of women, all vying for the Sultan's attention, their futures hanging by the thread of a single night. Most concubines were forgotten within days. But Hürrem was different. She had something no one else dared to wield: her mind. While others tried to please with beauty alone, Hürrem captivated with her wit, her laughter, and her ability to make Suleiman feel something he had never felt before, an equal at his side. Against every expectation, she rose. From slave to favorite, from favorite to mother of his sons. And eventually, she would become something no woman in Ottoman history had ever been before: the Sultan's legal wife. This was not just a romance. It was a revolution. Hürrem and Suleiman's love would defy centuries of tradition, spark political intrigue, and forever change the course of an empire. The story of Hürrem and Suleiman was never meant to happen. Sultans did not fall in love. They ruled. For centuries, the harem had been a carefully managed institution, designed not for romance, but for dynasty. Women entered as captives or gifts, chosen for their beauty, and used to bear sons who might one day inherit the throne. When their purpose was fulfilled, they faded into silence, forgotten behind the latticed screens of the palace. But Hürrem refused to fade. When she first entered Suleiman's chambers, she did not tremble. She did not bow like the others, whispering rehearsed words of devotion. Instead, she laughed, a bold, disarming laugh that no one in the empire would have dared in front of the Sultan. And something strange happened. Suleiman laughed too. That single moment, a spark of genuine human connection in a world of power and fear, was the beginning of a love that neither the palace nor the empire could contain. Night after night, the Sultan found himself returning to her, not just for passion, but for conversation. She spoke to him not as a servant, but as a partner. She asked questions about his battles, his poetry, his dreams. She teased him, challenged him, even argued with him, things no one had ever dared to do. And Suleiman, the man who commanded armies and bent nations to his will, discovered something intoxicating. Hürrem made him feel human. This was dangerous. The court began to whisper. Why did the Sultan ignore his other concubines? Why did he spend his nights with a single woman, breaking the unspoken rule that the harem must never belong to one voice alone. Even more shocking, Suleiman began writing poetry. Love poems. Not for a mistress, not for a fleeting passion, but for Hurrem. In delicate Ottoman verse, he called her Hurrem, the joyful one, a name that replaced her old identity, erasing the slave she had been and crowning her as the woman he adored. But love in the palace was never just love. It was power. With each child Hurrem bore, her influence grew. And with each passing year, Suleiman defied the traditions of his ancestors more openly. Other concubines were dismissed. Hurrem became not just the favorite, but the only one. For the first time in Ottoman history, a sultan allowed himself to be bound to a single woman. The empire was scandalized. Advisors warned him that obsession with one concubine could bring ruin. Rivals in the harem plotted against Hurrem, desperate to end her rise before it was too late. Even Suleiman's own family began to question her hold over him. But none of it mattered. For Suleiman, Hurrem was not simply a concubine. She was his companion, his confidant, his equal. He was the sultan of the world. And yet, with her, he was just a man in love. The unlikely love of Hurrem and Suleiman was no passing affair. It was the foundation of a new order, one where a slave could stand beside the most powerful ruler on earth, not as a shadow, but as a queen. Their bond would break traditions, ignite envy, and set the stage for both triumph and tragedy. Because in the Ottoman court, love was never innocent. It was a weapon, and Hurrem knew how to wield it better than anyone. For centuries, the Ottoman dynasty had been built upon one iron rule. The sultan must never marry a concubine. Concubines were temporary, beautiful vessels to bear children, instruments of dynasty, nothing more. Marriage was reserved for foreign princesses, political alliances, women whose names would never threaten the balance of power inside the harem. But Suleiman, blinded, or perhaps enlightened, by his love for Hurrem, shattered that rule. It began quietly. He dismissed his other concubines, sending them away with gifts and silence. The harem, once a stage of rivalry, became a theater centered on a single woman. For the first time in living memory, one voice, Hurrem's, carried more weight than all the others combined. The whispers spread like wildfire. Viziers shook their heads. The Grand Mufti, keeper of Islamic law, frowned. Even Suleiman's own mother, Valide Sultan, traditionally the most powerful woman in the palace, watched in alarm. But Suleiman would not yield. In a move that stunned the empire, he did the unthinkable. He married Hurrem, a slave girl, a foreigner, a concubine. The wedding was a spectacle no one had dared imagine. In the heart of Istanbul, the palace erupted in days of feasting. Streets were lit with torches, music thundered through the city, and fountains flowed with wine. The sultan had taken a wife, his concubine, and made her the legal empress of the empire. The reaction was seismic. To the common people, it was a fairy tale, a woman who had risen from chains to crown. To the elite, it was an outrage. Hurrem was no mere ornament. She was a queen with a mind sharper than any blade. And with marriage came legitimacy. She was no longer just the sultan's passion. She was untouchable. Hurrem moved quickly to secure her position. She bore Suleiman's sons, each one a potential heir to the throne. Every child tightened her grip. Every birth shifted the balance of power. But this was not just about motherhood. She rewrote the rules of the harem. Instead of remaining hidden in the shadows, she stepped into politics. She wrote letters to foreign kings, forged diplomatic alliances, and even engaged in charity projects across the empire. Mosques, schools, hospitals, all rose with her name engraved upon them. For the first time, the sultan's consort was not invisible. She was a public figure. The Ottoman court had never seen anything like it. But breaking rules always comes at a cost. Hurrem's rise meant others had to fall. The first casualty was Mahidevran, Suleiman's earlier favorite, mother of his eldest son, Mustafa. Once secure, Mahidevran now found herself exiled to the shadows, stripped of influence. Her son Mustafa, the shining hope of the dynasty, suddenly had rivals, Hurrem's sons. The rivalry between the two women was not simply personal. It was dynastic war. If Mustafa succeeded his father, Hurrem's children would be doomed. If one of Hurrem's sons took the throne, Mustafa's fate would be sealed. The harem became a battlefield drenched not in blood, but in whispers, poison, and silk cords. And through it all, Suleiman stood by Hurrem. Some believed he was bewitched, trapped under her spell. Others argued he knew exactly what he was doing, that Hurrem's intelligence made her an asset, not a danger. What no one could deny was this: his love for her was unlike anything seen before in the Ottoman dynasty. When Suleiman marched to war, he carried her letters with him, responding with poetry of his own. When advisors warned against her influence, he silenced them. When enemies mocked his marriage, he ignored them. He was the Sultan of the world. He needed no one's approval. But by choosing love over tradition, Suleiman and Hurrem unleashed forces neither could control. Their union redefined the empire, but it also planted the seeds of betrayal, fratricide, and blood. For in the Ottoman world, power was never shared, and Hurrem's rise meant that others, many others, would fall. The breaking of rules was only the beginning. What started as a love story would soon spiral into a saga of ambition, rivalry, and tragedy, one that would shake the empire to its very core. History has never agreed on what bound Suleiman and Hurrem together. Was it love, or was it power? To some, their story is the greatest romance of the Ottoman age. They point to Suleiman's poetry, verses written in his own hand, not for his victories, not for his empire, but for her. He never wrote love poems to any other woman. His words described her as his Hurrem, his joy, the light of his world. And when he was far away on campaign, he carried her letters, sometimes responding in secret during the chaos of war. To his generals, he was a conqueror. To his people, he was a sultan. But to her, he was simply a man writing love notes to his wife. And yet, others see something far colder. They argue that Hurrem was no innocent lover, but a strategist, a survivor who turned her chains into a crown. In the ruthless world of the harem, women lived and died by a sultan's attention. To secure her children's future, Hurrem needed more than beauty. She needed devotion, exclusive devotion, and she achieved it. Every step she took strengthened her position. By convincing Suleiman to break centuries of custom, to marry her, to dismiss his other concubines, she not only secured her own survival, but changed the empire itself. Critics whisper that this was not love. It was calculation, the most brilliant political maneuver ever executed within the Ottoman palace. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. Love and politics were never separate in the Ottoman court. Affection could not exist without consequences. A smile in the harem could spark a rivalry. A whispered promise could decide the fate of a dynasty. For Hurrem and Suleiman, passion and power became one and the same. Their bond was genuine, but it was also weaponized. Hurrem used her closeness to Suleiman to influence state matters, advising him on appointments, diplomacy, even military campaigns. She wrote to foreign rulers in her own name, something no sultan's consort had ever dared. She funded schools, hospitals, and mosques, ensuring that her name, not just Suleiman's, would live in stone. This was more than love. It was legacy. But the cost was immense. Her rise meant the fall of others, and nowhere was this clearer than in her rivalry with Mahidevran and Mustafa. For centuries, the Ottoman dynasty followed the brutal law of fratricide. Only one heir could inherit the throne. The rest would perish. Hurrem understood this rule better than anyone. For her children to live, Mustafa could not. And so, whispers began to swirl, that Hurrem poisoned Suleiman's mind against his eldest son, that she and her allies orchestrated the downfall of the prince beloved by the people. Whether true or not, history remembers the outcome. Mustafa was strangled in his father's tent, his body buried quietly, his supporters crushed. And from that moment, Hurrem's son stood in line for the throne. So, was Hurrem a lover or a conspirator? Was Suleiman a man blinded by passion, or a ruler who allowed himself to be guided by the only person he trusted? 500 years later, the answer remains elusive. What is certain is this: their love story was not a simple tale of romance. It was a collision of affection and ambition, devotion and survival. And perhaps that is why their bond still fascinates us. Because in the palace of Topkapi, love was never just love. It was power. When Hurrem Sultan died in 1558, the palace fell silent. For more than 3 decades, she had walked its marble halls, reshaping not just the harem, but the empire itself. She left behind not only children and rivals, but a dynasty forever altered by her presence. For Suleiman, the loss was devastating. The man who had commanded armies across continents, who had stood unshaken against kings and emperors, now found himself broken by the death of one woman. He never took another wife. He never replaced her. In his later years, the great conqueror was remembered not as the lion of battle, but as a grieving husband, carrying the absence of Hurrem like a wound that would never heal. Yet the legacy of their love was far from gentle. Hurrem's rise had set into motion a storm of succession struggles, betrayals, and blood. The execution of Prince Mustafa cast a shadow that would haunt Suleiman until his death. The empire that once stood untouchable now trembled under the weight of its own fractures. And still, Hurrem's influence endured. She was the first consort to wield real political power, the first to step beyond the shadows of the harem and into the world stage. Her descendants would rule the Ottoman throne for centuries. 500 years later, her name still divides history. To some, she was a schemer who destroyed an empire. To others, she was a queen who transformed it. But one truth remains unshaken. Against every law, every tradition, every whisper of doubt, Hurrem and Suleiman's love story survived time itself. It was not a fairy tale. It was something far greater. A love powerful enough to rewrite history.